If you have ever loved someone so much that you were willing to disappear a little so they could shine, then this story is going to break your heart and put it back together at the same time. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now, because we tell one of these unforgettable true-to-life stories every single week, and you will not want to miss the next one. Now, let's begin. In a quiet working-class neighborhood on the edge of a mid-sized American town, where the streetlights flickered orange and the houses all looked slightly tired from years of holding families together, there lived a man named David Miller. David was 38 years old, with rough hands, a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, and eyes that always looked like they were doing math in the background. Bills, hours, groceries, gas money. He had not always looked this way. 10 years ago, David had been a different man. Lighter, louder, quicker to laugh. But 10 years ago, he had also still had a wife. Her name was Sarah, and she had died giving birth to their daughter Emma. It was sudden, one of those cruel medical complications that no one warns you about, and David had walked out of that hospital as a widower and a father in the same afternoon. He never talked about that day. Not to his mother, not to his co-workers, not even to himself late at night when the silence in the house got loud. He simply picked Emma up in her tiny yellow blanket, looked at her small, sleeping face, and made a promise that would define the rest of his life. Whatever it takes, she will never feel what I'm feeling right now. She will never feel alone. David and Sarah had met in community college, in of all places a night class on basic accounting that neither of them particularly wanted to be in. Sarah had been the one to laugh first at David's terrible joke about depreciation schedules, and David liked to say that he fell in love with her laugh 3 full weeks before he worked up the courage to ask her to coffee. They married young, poor, and happy. The kind of happy that doesn't need much because it has each other. They talked in those early years about the life they wanted. A little house, maybe 2 kids, Sarah going back to school eventually to become a nurse, David someday opening his own small repair shop instead of working for someone else. Emma was supposed to be the first of 2 children. Instead, she became the only piece of Sarah that David had left, and he poured every unspent hope from that unlived future directly into her. 8 years later, that promise had shaped every decision David made. He worked as a mechanic at a small auto shop during the day, hands stained permanently with engine grease, and 3 nights a week he drove for a rideshare app until nearly 2 in the morning. Weekends, when other fathers were taking their kids to the park or watching football with friends, David picked up shifts stocking shelves at the 24-hour grocery store outside of town, the one nobody wanted to work at because of the overnight hours and the manager who never smiled. Emma, now 8 years old, had inherited her mother's dark curly hair and her father's stubborn chin. She was bright, the kind of bright that teachers write exceptional about on report cards, and she loved 2 things above all else: drawing horses in the margins of her homework and her father. She did not know, not fully, how much her father was sacrificing to give her the small, steady life she had. She knew he worked a lot. She knew that sometimes he fell asleep on the couch still wearing his work boots. She did not know that David had not bought himself a new pair of shoes in 3 years. She did not know that he skipped lunch most days, telling himself he wasn't that hungry, so that there would be enough left over for her horseback riding lessons, a birthday gift from a father who wanted his daughter to have one beautiful, impractical thing in her life, something just for joy, not survival. The story we are about to tell you is about the 8 months that tested David Miller more than any single moment since the day Sarah died, the 8 months, where his sacrifice reached a breaking point and where an entire community learned exactly what he had been quietly carrying alone in the dark. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. David was under a car at the shop when his phone buzzed in his coverall pocket. It was Emma's school. His stomach dropped the way it always did when the school called during the day, a reflex left over from too many years of bracing for bad news. "Mr. Miller," the school nurse said, her voice careful. "Emma's fine, she's okay, but she fainted during recess. We think it might be low blood sugar, but we'd like you to take her to see a doctor as soon as possible." David left work without asking, without even taking off his coveralls, grease still under his fingernails, as he signed Emma out of school and carried her, pale and drowsy, to his old pickup truck. The pediatrician's office led to a referral, and the referral led to a specialist, and the specialist, after 2 weeks of tests that ate through David's meager savings account like acid, delivered news that made the ground tilt under David's feet. Emma had a heart condition, rare, not immediately life-threatening, but degenerative if left untreated, and requiring a surgery that the family's basic insurance would only partially cover. The number the hospital's financial office finally gave him, after David asked 3 times because he was sure he had misheard, was $18,000. The specialist, a kind but overworked cardiologist named Dr. Reyes, tried to explain it gently. "Think of it like a small valve that isn't closing the way it should," he said, sketching a rough diagram on the back of a prescription pad because he could see David needed something to look at, something concrete, rather than words alone. Right now, Emma's body is compensating. Kids are remarkably good at that. But over the next year or two, without the procedure, that compensation runs out, and it gets a lot harder to manage. He said the word urgent carefully, the way doctors do when they want you to understand a timeline without making a frightened father panic in front of his daughter. David nodded along, asked the right questions, wrote down the right things in the Notes app on his cracked screen phone, and understood, underneath all of it, that the countdown had already started. That night, after Emma was asleep, David sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and did the math 3 separate times, hoping a 4th column of subtraction might produce a different answer. It never did. $18,000 was not a number that appeared through overtime alone. It was a number that required him to become someone else for a while, someone with fewer needs, fewer hours of sleep, fewer small comforts, and no time at all left over for himself. David did not cry in front of the doctor. He did not cry in front of Emma, who sat swinging her feet on the exam table, more worried about missing her writing lesson than about anything the doctor had said. He waited until he got back to the truck, sat behind the wheel in the hospital parking garage, and put both hands over his face for exactly 90 seconds. Then he wiped his eyes, started the engine, and drove home, already running numbers in his head. $18,000. He had $412 in savings. What followed was not a dramatic single decision. It was 100 small ones, stacked one on top of another like bricks, each one shaving away a piece of David's own life to build a wall of protection around his daughters. He sold his motorcycle first, a beat-up but beloved 1998 Harley that had belonged to his own father, the one thing David had kept just for himself through every hard year since Sarah died. It went for $2,300 to a stranger from an online listing who did not know, and would never know, that he was holding a piece of a dead man's memory in his hands. David picked up a 4th night of rideshare driving, then a 5th. He started skipping breakfast entirely, not just lunch, telling Emma he ate at the shop when really he was pouring the grocery money into a coffee can under his bed labeled, in Emma's handwriting from when she'd helped him organize Dad's fix-it money. He picked up side jobs fixing neighbors' cars in the driveway on Sundays, the one day he used to reserve entirely for Emma, pancakes, cartoons, the park. Now Sundays became 6-hour stretches of David flat on his back under strangers' cars, Emma sitting nearby on an overturned bucket, handing him wrenches and narrating stories about horses to keep him company, not fully understanding why Daddy didn't have time to push her on the swings anymore. He stopped seeing his few friends. He stopped answering his mother's calls some weeks because she would ask how he was doing, and he did not trust himself to answer that question honestly without unraveling. Emma, for her part, was not as oblivious as David hoped. Children rarely are. She began leaving small, quiet clues that she understood more than she said out loud. An extra granola bar placed silently on David's nightstand. "In case you get hungry, Daddy." A hand-drawn card that read, "You are the strongest dad in the whole world," tucked into his work bag without explanation, a habit of hugging him a little longer at bedtime than she used to. She never asked him directly why he was so tired all the time, perhaps sensing, in the particular wisdom that some children develop too early, that some questions are kinder left unasked. By month 4, David had lost 11 pounds he could not afford to lose. His hands, always rough, had started to shake slightly in the mornings. Exhaustion, the doctor at an urgent care visit he almost didn't go to would later tell him, compounded by significant, sustained stress. David waved off the diagnosis. He did not have time to be sick. Sick was a luxury for people with savings accounts and paid time off, neither of which David had. There was one Sunday in particular, near the end of month 3, that David would later think of as the lowest point of the entire ordeal, though at the time it felt almost ordinary, which was in its own way the saddest part. He was under a neighbor's minivan in the driveway, replacing a timing belt for $60 cash, when the neighbor's kids came out to play in the yard laughing, tossing a football back and forth. Emma sat on her overturned bucket a few feet away, watching them instead of playing because David had asked her gently to stay close so he could keep an eye on her while he worked. She did not complain. She simply watched the other kids, quietly, the way she had learned to watch a lot of things quietly that year, and asked David, without any real bitterness in her small voice, "Daddy, when you're done being tired, can we play football too?" David told her soon, sweetheart, soon, and then had to turn his face back under the minivan for a full minute before he trusted his voice again. He began keeping a private ritual, one he never told anyone about, not even, years later, Reverend Thomas. Every Friday night, after Emma was asleep, David would take the coffee can labeled, "Dad's Fix-It Money," out from under his bed, count what was inside it down to the last dollar, and write the total on a torn corner of paper that he taped inside his closet door, underneath a photo of Sarah holding newborn Emma. It was not for organization. It was a kind of prayer, the closest thing David had to one. A weekly report to a wife who could no longer hear it, updating her on how close they were getting to keeping their daughter safe. The hardest part was not the exhaustion. It was the quiet ache of watching Emma's world get smaller without her understanding why. No new soccer cleats when hers wore through. He found her a used pair 2 sizes too big and stuffed the toes with cotton, telling her it was so they'd last longer as she grew. No birthday party for her 9th birthday. Just the two of them and a store-bought cake. David forcing a smile so bright it hurt his face while doing math in his head about whether he could still afford her medication refill that month. And yet, through all of it, David never once let Emma see him break. He learned to cry in the shower, where the water covered the sound. He learned to laugh loudly at her jokes, even on the nights his whole body screamed for sleep. He learned that love, real love, the kind his own father had never quite shown him, was not a feeling. It was 1,000 small, invisible acts of disappearing so someone else could be seen. It was Mrs. Alvarez, David's elderly next-door neighbor, who first noticed something was deeply wrong. She had lived beside the Millers for 6 years and had watched David go from a tired but present father to something closer to a ghost. Thinner, grayer, his truck's headlight still cracked from a fender bender he clearly could not afford to fix. Sitting in his driveway working on it himself at midnight under a shop light because that was the only hour he had. One evening, she brought over a plate of tamales the way she often did, and found David asleep sitting upright at his kitchen table, a stack of medical bills fanned out in front of him like a losing hand of cards, his head resting on his folded arms. Emma was at the table too, quietly coloring a picture of a horse, careful not to wake her father, an 8-year-old girl who had somehow learned to tiptoe around her own home. Mrs. Alvarez did not wake David. She looked at those bills, just enough to understand the shape of what she was seeing, and she went home and made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to her daughter, who worked at the local news station. The second was to the pastor of the small community church 3 blocks over, a man named Reverend Thomas who had baptized Emma as a baby, back when Sarah was still alive and the Millers were still, technically, a family of 3. What happened next unfolded over the following 6 weeks, almost entirely without David's knowledge, because David, stubborn, proud, terrified of being seen as someone who needed help, would have refused every bit of it if he'd been asked. Reverend Thomas started quietly. He mentioned to a few members of the congregation, in careful, respectful terms, that a family in the community was going through an unusually hard season and could use support, without naming names at first, without violating David's dignity. Before David even knew there was a plan, word moved the way it does in small, tightly knit communities. Quietly, then all at once. The auto shop owner where David worked, a gruff man named Tony who had never said a kind word aloud. In the 15 years David had worked for him, learned what was happening, and immediately started quietly rounding David's paychecks up, paying the difference out of his own pocket, telling David it was a raise that had been overdue, a small lie in service of a larger kindness. The rideshare app's local driver community, a loose group of about 30 drivers who knew each other from a group chat, started covering David's shifts without telling him, splitting his hours among themselves so David could go home 2 hours earlier some nights, telling him the app had adjusted the algorithm, when really they had simply decided one by one to carry a small piece of his weight. Emma's riding instructor, a woman named Carla, who had noticed David quietly, asking, months earlier, if there was a payment plan available, waived the remaining lessons for the season entirely, telling David that Emma had won a scholarship, a gentle fiction to protect his pride. Emma's own teacher, Mrs. Patterson, quietly organized the other parents in the third-grade class to take turns picking Emma up on the 2 evenings a week David's shifts overlapped, folding it so naturally into the regular carpool rotation that David never once suspected it was anything other than routine. And a woman David had never even met, a retired ICU nurse named Patricia, who attended Reverend Thomas's church and had heard the story secondhand, began quietly mailing small, unsigned envelopes of cash to the church office each week for the mechanics family, refusing every time the pastor tried to thank her by name, telling him only that she had once been a single parent herself, decades ago, and remembered exactly what that kind of tired felt like. And Mrs. Alvarez's daughter, true to her word, produced a short segment for the local news about quiet heroes in our community, carefully built around David's story with his dignity fiercely protected, no pity, no spectacle, just the plain, unglamorous truth of a father who had sold his father's motorcycle to save his daughter's heart. The segment did not use David's last name. It did not need to. Within 2 days, it had been shared thousands of times online, and a small fundraiser, started by Reverend Thomas's church without David's knowledge, had reached far. Beyond anything anyone had expected, David found out the way most quiet, hard-working people find out that the world has been watching them all along, by accident. It was a Thursday evening. David had just finished a rideshare shift, a shift that had felt strangely short, though he hadn't questioned it, too tired to question anything, and he walked into the community hall for what he believed was Emma's small end-of-season riding club gathering, a little gesture Carla had arranged for the kids. Instead, he walked into a room of nearly 200 people, neighbors, Tony from the shop, half the rideshare driver group chat in person for the first time, Emma's teachers, Mrs. Alvarez in her best dress, and Reverend Thomas standing at the front holding a poster board covered in a number that David could not immediately process, $24,600. For a moment, David simply stood in the doorway, his work jacket still on, grease still faintly visible under his fingernails, utterly frozen. Emma, who had been let in on the surprise by Carla an hour earlier and had spent that hour vibrating with the effort of keeping a secret, ran across the room and threw her arms around her father's waist. "Daddy," she said, everybody knows what you did for me." David's knees genuinely buckled. Tony from the shop, of all people, was the one who caught him under the arm and half laughed, half choked out, "Sit down before you fall down, you stubborn idiot," which from Tony was practically a love song. Reverend Thomas explained it simply, in front of the whole room, because David deserved to hear the truth plainly and not have it hidden from him the way David had hidden his own struggle from everyone else. He told the story of the motorcycle. He told the story of the shower-cried tears Mrs. Alvarez had guessed at but never confirmed until David, standing there in front of everyone, finally, quietly, admitted it was true. He told the story of a man who had spent 8 months disappearing, piece by piece, so that his daughter would never have to feel what he'd felt the day her mother died. Alone and unprotected. "You didn't ask for help," Reverend Thomas said, looking directly at David, "because you didn't think you deserved it. But love like yours doesn't ask to be seen. It gets seen anyway." Tony, still gripping David's arm, cleared his throat roughly and added his own piece, uninvited and unpolished in the way that made it land even harder. 15 years you've worked for me," he said, "and not once, not one single time did you ever ask me for anything you didn't already earn twice over. I should have noticed sooner. We all should have." Around the room, several people were openly crying now, including, David noticed with a strange jolt, 2 of the rideshare drivers he had only ever known as usernames and profile pictures in a group chat, men whose faces he was seeing clearly for the first time, even though they had quietly been giving up their own paychecks for him for weeks. Mrs. Alvarez made her way slowly to the front of the room, leaning on her cane, and took David's rough, grease-stained hand in both of her small, papery ones. "I've watched you raise that girl alone for 8 years," she said, And I never once saw you ask this street for a single thing. I finally decided the street was going to give it to you anyway, whether you asked or not. David, who had survived the worst day of his life without breaking in public, who had held himself together through 4 jobs and 11 lost pounds and a coffee can full of secrets, finally lost the fight against his own tears completely, right there in front of 200 people, with his daughter's arms still wrapped tight around his waist. The $24,600 covered Emma's surgery in full, with enough left over, placed by unanimous vote of the fundraiser's small organizing committee over David's tearful, red-faced protests, to buy David a modest, reliable used truck to replace his dying one, and to open a small college savings account in Emma's name, the first dollar of financial security either of them had ever had room to imagine. Emma's surgery took place 6 weeks later. It was a success. The surgeon, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Osei, came out to the waiting room afterward to find not just David, but Mrs. Alvarez, Tony, Carla, 3 of the rideshare drivers, and Reverend Thomas all waiting together, all present for a man who, 8 months earlier, had believed with his whole exhausted heart that he was entirely alone in the world. "She did wonderfully," Dr. Osei said. "You should be very proud." David, who had not cried in front of another living soul in over 8 months, finally let go, right there in the waiting room, surrounded by a community he hadn't known was watching, hadn't known was ready to catch him the moment he stopped insisting on carrying everything alone. There is an epilogue to this story that matters as much as everything that came before it. 6 months after the surgery, David still works at the auto shop, though Tony has quietly, permanently kept his pay at the raised rate. No longer pretending it's temporary, David still drives rideshare 2 nights a week, not 5, because 2 nights is a choice now, not a desperate necessity. He bought himself a new pair of work boots, his first in 3 years, and when Emma noticed and asked why, he told her simply, "Because I finally let myself." Emma, now recovering fully, rides horses every Saturday and has started, at Carla's gentle suggestion, teaching the youngest beginner riders in the club how to hold the reins, passing forward the same kindness that had once been quietly extended to her. David also did something he had not done in almost a decade. He went back to Tony's shop one evening after closing, alone, and asked if Tony would ever consider taking on a partner instead of just an employee, someone to split the workload and, eventually, the ownership. Tony, who had spent 15 years pretending not to be sentimental about anything, had to leave the room for a minute before he came back and said gruffly, "Took you long enough to ask." It was not the repair shop David and Sarah had once dreamed about in their poor, happy early 20s, not exactly. But it was close enough that David, standing in the shop that night with the smell of motor oil and the hum of the old shop radio, allowed himself, for the first time in years, to imagine a future that had more in it than just getting through. Mrs. Alvarez still brings tamales on Sundays, though now she often stays to eat them with David and Emma at the kitchen table instead of leaving the plate at the door and hurrying home. Reverend Thomas checks in every few weeks, not out of duty anymore, but because, he says, he genuinely likes watching how the story keeps going. And once a year, on the anniversary of that night in the community hall, the same group gathers again. No fundraiser this time, no poster board, just a potluck dinner that has slowly become a tradition, a small, ordinary miracle repeating itself once every 12 months. And David, who had spent 8 months believing that love meant disappearing so someone else could be seen, learned something new in that community hall, something he tries to teach Emma every single day now, that real strength is not only in how much you can carry alone, it is also in allowing yourself, when the weight finally becomes too much, to be carried. If this story moved you even a little, remember David Miller the next time you see someone quietly struggling near you, the coworker who always looks a little too tired, the neighbor whose lights are on too late, the father who never asks for help. You may never know the full weight of what they are carrying, but you can always choose, the way an entire community chose for David, to help carry it anyway. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told and shared, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one.